Okay guys, so the next video we want to talk about in the whole conversation of program design, whether you're programming for yourself or another individual, once we know how long we're going to be doing a certain thing for, then we need to decide, as I talked about in my last video, we want to decide on our training split, so essentially just what we're going to be doing in each individual session. Next up, we want to talk about how much is appropriate to do in each individual session. So volume selection is the next topic that we want to discuss. Now, just to make this clear, if you are in a particular phase of training in which you're trying to produce maximum results, whether your results or the desired outcome is muscle growth or strength or whatever it is, typically more volume is best. But the thing you have to understand is we don't want to do so much volume that you can't recover from it. So we always want to operate within our recovery capacity. So if you notice that you've selected a volume that is way too high and you're just not consistently recovering on time for your next session and your performance is stalling or sometimes even going down, and let's say on a day-to-day basis you're persistently yawning throughout the day, your cognitive function is really bad, you're potentially overtraining, which is a very real thing. Alternatively, you could reframe that as under-recovering, but it doesn't matter. If you're overdoing it in any sense, which can definitely happen, then you can absolutely alter this. But essentially, we want to have a conversation to find a starting place. Now, as I said, your starting place can change if you notice it's too much and or too little. If you notice you can handle more, absolutely manipulate it over time as well. But just to establish some sort of a starting point when designing a program in the beginning, we want to look at 4 main factors. Now, I'll be honest, if I really sat and thought about it, I could think of a million more, I'm sure. But all of the minor considerations fall, seemingly to me, under these 4 major categories. So, category number 1, time. How much time do you and or the person you are programming for, how much time do they have to realistically spend on a session and in the gym across the week? Some people are busier than others. This is a genuine consideration. It doesn't mean someone is lazy, it just means that they have other things in their life, and other things deserve respect. For example, I often have some clients who are really hardworking, busy professionals, potentially business owners, and especially if they're going through a particularly busy period at work, they have less time. So I need to be more efficient and logical with what I decide to prescribe for them. And yes, there's other variables that we can manipulate, like exercise selection and potential intensifiers and supersets and training techniques that we can essentially use to cram more stimulus into a given session. But the first thing we want to consider is time. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is goals. Now, obviously, someone who is training for muscle growth or hypertrophy, they're probably, as you might have heard, going to want to do a bit more volume than somebody who is training for strength and or potentially someone else who's training for endurance and whatever it is, okay? We have to look at essentially how much fatigue their average session is inducing, in which I'll talk about a bit more in a second, and we want to consider what's going to produce the best results, okay? So if someone's goals are hypertrophy, typically they're going to be slightly higher volumes. If someone's strength, a little bit lower volumes. And if someone is focusing a bit more on endurance and they're training in the gym, for another example is just to supplement and largely just for injury prevention and things of that nature, they're already receiving a ton of fatigue from running 1,000,000 miles a week that you'll obviously be doing a little bit less in the gym. So that's up, goals. Now next, strength. Huge consideration, but understand that the stronger someone gets, on average, the more fatigue their average set and or session induces, okay? And this can be not just person to person, different person to person, it can also be different to the same person as they get stronger as well, okay? So essentially, the stronger someone gets, the more fatigue that they cause by training in general, okay? So when I sign up a client, one of or a few of the major things that I look out for when I'm going to gather considerations for designing their program is their strength level, and then other minor considerations like age and obviously training frequency and things of this nature. And this can help me decide how much I assume an individual can tolerate, okay? Now, the 4th and final one, and I'll talk about genetics in a second because it probably deserves its own honorable mention. The 4th and final one that I've written down is phase, okay? Now, this is a little bit more of a minor consideration, in my opinion, but depending on the phase in which someone's at, let's say they're in peak off season and they're trying to really maximize muscle growth and they've got a ton of calories coming in, as opposed to that same individual, and you put them in the deep waters of prep, they're super lean, their natural testosterone production is completely out the window, a little bit less volume is probably required in both of those scenarios. When someone's super tired, super beaten up, and the recovery's out the window because of the phase that they are in, let's say it's a fat loss phase, in particular a more extreme one, they're going to be able to tolerate less volume, okay? So that's another consideration. Now, following on from what I just quickly mentioned there, genetics also play a large component. And you'll often hear this conversation online about, oh, some people can just genuinely handle more volume. And it makes it seem like some people can magically handle twice as much as the next person. On average across the population, in my experience at the very least, especially if you train in a fairly consistent way with fairly consistent training intensity, then the variance across the population is not as big as some people might allude to. Although, that being said, there are definitely outliers. And I've come across a couple of clients that spring to mind who can tolerate 3 exercises more than another person. All training to absolute failure and all of the rest of it. Okay, so genuinely is a thing, and the major consideration for you as an individual with regard to that conversation is if you put something in place that you think, yeah, that makes sense, I'm going to try this, then you can manipulate it after. So what you put in place is not set in stone. You can absolutely change it. In fact, I would argue you should change it. And what you change it to could be a conversation for a different video. But essentially, all we're doing is taking a best guess in taking all these factors into consideration, potentially your training experience and your training history. You're going to look at what you're doing in the gym and how hard you train and all the rest of it. And you're just going to decide on what's an appropriate amount of volume. Now, if you're programming for a client and you're a coach and you're not sure how much volume that person can essentially tolerate, then maybe err on the slight side of caution, but don't be too cautious about it because you want them to work hard. Potentially err on the slight side of caution if you assume an average individual can complete 6 exercises that are high stimulus, high fatigue cost exercises, or at least half of them are, and you're going to get them to do a good job. If you assume on average people can tolerate 6 exercises or however many sets, then potentially just starting with 5 and then prompt them with questions. Prompt them, see how the recovery is, ask them if they can tolerate more within their program, and that not only makes you look good, but it makes the client really understand and appreciate that you are looking out for them as an individual and it's not just a cookie cutter program. So that is volume selection. Now, just to recap, we're essentially all taking all these considerations into account, and then we want to decide what's going to produce the maximum result, but within our recovery capacity. And as I said, you can always tailor if you need to. So that is volume selection. I'm going to stop ranting. If you have any questions, drop them in the WhatsApp group, and I'll chat to you in the next one.